Hey, y'all, welcome back to another episode of the Texas SignalCast. This is a special episode. We're going to talk about the May elections that are happening right now, mostly focused on what's going on in Austin, but there's stuff all over the state. I, of course, am your host, Joe Deshotel, and I'm here with a friend and colleague, David Leffler. Hey, David, how you doing?
Joe, I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be a part of this and to break down all of these propositions that, for the average person, may not be the most flashy thing, but obviously have just ramifications across the state, not just in Austin.
Yeah, voter turnout is historically low in Texas, and May elections, of course, they're even lower. And so part of these, at least some of these, are about increasing voter turnout, or at least that's what the proponents say.
Mhm.
So for transparency's sake, I will note that I am on the leadership council for the Austinites for Progressive Reform, which is supporting several of these amendments, which we will go down. And of course, these are in Austin specifically. But I think one of the reasons that we want to look at Austin specifically is because so much of what ends up happening across the state starts here in Austin. And we're in the middle of a legislative session right now where a lot of the priority social issues, especially in the state kind of taking away local control, a lot of these all come from things that have been happening in the city of Austin. And so in some ways, this is kind of a preview of what we're probably going to see happening in other cities and statewide that could have statewide ramifications. And so you had a chance to talk to one of the chief architects of the Austinites for Progressive Reform campaign. I think you are working on a story about that right now.
That's right. Yeah, just a few hours ago, I got off the phone with Jim Wick. He's actually the campaign manager for Austinites for Progressive Reform, and we just had a really good and substantive conversation about the variety of different platforms that they're really pushing right now for the upcoming, actually ongoing rather, uh, election that ends on May 1st in Austin. And the first thing that really comes to mind, if we can go into obviously the details of those propositions and the way that they affect Austinites and in effect down the road affect Texans. But yeah, I think, you always hear about, right, Austin being, the Austin bashing. That's just like, that is what Texas state Republicans go for. Just keep beating that pinata. But what you're seeing more and more now, I think, is Austin also being kind of the petri dish for ways to kind of try to overcome that, right? That it's no longer just Austin proposes something and then it gets smacked down and by the Texas state legislature, but rather, there's a little bit more of an intentional effort to come up with even more progressive means to basically, again, overcome some of the more, repressive measures taken by the state over the years.
Yeah, and we're seeing this happen in part because we're seeing all the voter suppression efforts that are happening all over the country. There's a lot of focus on Georgia, but I think now the country recognizes that the same thing is happening in Texas. We're an even bigger state. There's even more at stake. I mean, it's hard to, one up Georgia after they basically gave us a president and two senators and then the whole Senate by that. But we know that because of how big Texas is, that it could really change the presidential dynamics, really for the foreseeable future. And so, the same folks at the state capitol, they know this too.
Yeah.
And as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. We see in Harris County, they were very innovative in the way that they came up with new strategies to allow people to vote with drive-through voting
Yeah.
and late night voting, essentially for some folks, and mailing out mail ballot applications so people could fill them out and vote by mail because it was a pandemic. And these are all the very specific things that the state legislature are taking a look at, trying to remove as we speak the ability to do that. And so we started out talking about how Austin is usually that archetype that they attack. Harris County is really done some very progressive, innovative things that's also capturing their attention.
Yeah.
And for folks in Houston to know that, um, this is statewide. Early voting has already started yesterday. It will go through April 27th, and election day is on Saturday, May 1st. But in Harris County, they are still employing these. So if you want to do drive-through voting in Harris County for the May election that's going on now, you can still do that, which is great. So any bill that the legislature passes to change that won't take effect likely until laws go into effect on September 1st. So it's possible it could affect, say, a November constitutional amendment election, which Texas usually has after a legislative session. But you know, kind of going back to these specific reforms, one of them is actually to, and we could go down each one, obviously. One
Yeah.
of them
Yeah.
is specifically to move the mayoral election to November. And the idea is to, of course, do it when I think May of election of a presidential year, even more so, to make sure you capture sort of the biggest electorate possible.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I know, I mean, it seems, at least in Austin, it seems like a distant memory when in 2014 we had our first mayoral election that was held in November. And for context, from what I understand, every other major city, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, their mayoral elections are still held in May. So this seems like an even more grand leap on behalf of Austin. But yeah, essentially the measure is seeking to move the mayoral election to presidential terms, which would only make sense in terms of you want to capture the most amount of voters as possible. And this isn't just from a progressive agenda, right? This is about in the name of democracy. If you want the most amount of voters to be able to have a say in who is leading their city, then it only makes sense to do this. So the proposition would essentially, if passed, there's set to be a new mayoral election in Austin next year that would go as planned. And then that term, instead of going from 2022 to 2026, would be a 2-year term, and then come up again to 2024 to again go along with the presidential election.
Yeah, I do remember when we had these initial, and that's what kind of confused me when I first saw this one. I was like, wait, I thought we already did that, but this is to move it to the presidential election. So we're just again still just trying to maximize the number of people that come out, and there's a certain irony of asking May voters to, almost like dilute their vote in a sense, because your vote, if your vote is one of 50,000 in May, and then you go to 1.5 million in the next election cycle, in a sense, you're diluting your own power. But the idea is, like you said, it's like if we're pushing good ideas and we're doing the right thing to engage the community, then we should have the support of the community, and it's only right to include the most voices we can.
And you're right. I mean, I think that is the kind of cloud hanging over all of this, right? Is Austin has several progressive reforms on the table, and all of them are happening at a time that historically and systematically makes for lesser turnout. So like, it's going to be a little bit of time before, no matter what happens, we can dissect what the true ramifications of it being held at this time were. But you're right. Yeah, unfortunately, it's the system we have to go through, and it's the only way that we can get, a little bit further along and really kind of reimagining. But the thing that really also stands out to me is just how much, not just that, ingenuity comes out of desperate times, as you mentioned in Harris County, but also just that these reforms really can kind of snowball on each other. Because again, like, it was such a, mind-blowing thing to move the mayoral elections to the fall from May in Austin just 7 years ago. So to now be kind of going through all these other moves, it just shows that once you give people a little bit more taste of making voting more accessible, making it easier, making it more sensible, that it's just going to, progress begets progress in this case, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, these sets of propositions that address, democracy, that the Austinites for Progressive Reform are pushing are D, E, F, and G, and H. And the one we're, of course, discussing now to move the mayoral election is Prop D. So Prop E is actually my personal favorite, and it's ranked choice voting, also known as instant runoff. And it is also interesting in the sense that it's not clear if this is legal or not in the Texas code, as it were, written now. It's kind of an illegal gray area, so it's likely to be challenged in court if it passes. But there's really I don't see a lot of downside to it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the instant runoff? And
Yeah. I mean, I think as you're talking about, right, that it's there really isn't a major downside because again, if the whole point is to be able to get as many people to vote in a single election, so many of these city council races and mayoral races go down to runoffs, right? And so it doesn't really do any good or it doesn't do enough if you have everyone come out and they vote in the November presidential election for the mayor, and then it goes to a runoff in December, and then people basically again it's left to the same specific population that turns out, which is older and white and wealthier typically. That again, that still is kind of missing a piece there. So with this ranked voting choice, it ensures that people can not only have a say in terms of who their second and third choices are, but it ensures that the candidate is chosen by the largest populace possible.
yeah, and just to let people sort of know how it works, essentially is when you see a group of candidates on the ballot and maybe you have a favorite and you rank them as your first choice, but then you may actually have a second choice or a third choice that you actually would consider. Now I know a lot of folks may not. Maybe they have one person at the top. You don't actually have to rank all
Right.
of the choices. You can rank up to 5 choices if there are that many or more, but you don't have to. Your vote will count towards that candidate that you vote for. And in fact, I've seen, and it's similar where I'm from, and originally in Beaumont, they have at-large seats. Our
Mm.
council, we moved away from at large, but there are a lot of cities that still have it. And essentially, it's multiple people running for at large seats. And so, if there are two at large seats, you get to vote for two of them. And what will happen a lot of the times is the people vying for that race, they will tell their core supporters who like, just want them specifically to win to only vote for them and to save their other vote so that when in the aggregate, when you're counting, your vote is sort of, you're concentrating your vote for that one person instead of giving another person an opportunity to in the aggregate have more votes. So in this particular case with ranked choice, I think what you're going to see is some of the same effect there, where you're going to see people, their hardcore supporters may go in and only vote for that top choice. There are going to be a lot of other people. There may be one person who you absolutely like, I don't want this person, because this is what happens a lot, I think, is people will say, I really support this person, but I think I got to vote for this person because they're the more quote unquote viable candidate,
Totally.
and we
Totally.
can't risk letting that other person win. So you end up voting for your second choice instead of your first choice because you think it's a more practical vote. And I think we saw that with the presidential election this time around, with the primary, where a lot of people said, well, maybe we should vote for Joe Biden because he's the safe choice, or somebody else is the safe choice, when really you wanted to vote for an Andrew Yang or somebody who is a much more far reach of a candidate. Well, this system really allows sort of the cream to rise to the top, in the sense that you vote for the person you really believe you want to win. And then if you think, well, I'm going to make the safe choice my second choice, and then third and fourth or whatever, then it gives you that option, and you don't have to vote and then hope you made the right decision, and then, like you said, it goes to a runoff, and then you end up between maybe two people that you don't really want to see win the race. So the bottom line is, there's some complicated math underneath the instant runoff counting part of it, but on the surface, it saves money because you eliminate an entire new election that's a very low turnout election. Most people vote in November. They did their deed, then they go about their business. They're thinking about Christmas now. They're thinking about Thanksgiving,
Right.
and then we have these small elections where it's still the same group of insiders sort of get to have their say, and ultimately, despite a huge amount of people who voted in November, I've seen plenty of times where the person who gets the most votes in November will still end up losing the runoff
Yeah.
because their supporters think they won and they don't come back out in the runoff and vote for them again. And those people who got second or third place are really amped up and energized and like, we can do this, and they come out, and so a lot of times you end up with a person who is pretty unpopular winning in those scenarios. Much more likely for that to happen if you don't have the instant runoff. And I think one of the other sort of side effects of instant runoff is that because you want your opponent supporters to pick you as their number two choice, you the election campaigning tends to be less negative.
That's right.
Because if you just bash your opponent's supporters are going to take that personally, and they probably won't vote for you as their second choice or third choice at all. And so you want to court, you have to be able to court the your opponent's supporters in a way that you don't normally do if it's just an all or nothing type of election.
No, that's so true. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, if people are trying to think about this in, in kind of simple terms, not to be kind of, there's never always a binary, but essentially, do you want to democratize our voting system, right? And the idea that, we shouldn't have to be, you're mentioning how like the more kind of plugged in, more fervent supporters of someone will, maybe they'll be told to only vote for one person, right? And in the same sense, if there's a runoff, only the most fervent supporters will come out and vote. Someone shouldn't have to be like, I would love it if more people were involved in local politics and super enthusiastic, but you shouldn't have to be keeping up with every single issue and every single elected official or potential elected official in your city in order to help participate in the process. And that's why if you have someone, if they're going to come out, which people historically do more during the presidential election, they should have just as much a say as someone who would come out on a December 14th or whatever it may be. Because at the end of the day, they live in the city, they pay taxes, and they showed up to vote on election day. So it shouldn't be, again, reserved to the people who are most, kind of the traditional voting style. Because again, like that's, when you look at it, that doesn't really jive with what democracy is supposed to be about.
Right. And so that's prop E, ranked choice voting. And then there's prop F, which I think is the most controversial of this set of voting propositions. This is the quote unquote strong mayor versus strong manager proposition. I'm sure you had an interesting conversation with Jim about this one. How did that go?
It was good. It was good. One thing that that Jim Wick talked to me about, which I hadn't been aware of, so without kind of getting too Austin-y here, but essentially in Austin, a lot of Austin's racial and geographical segregation stemmed from this, what's called the 1928 master plan, where essentially all Black people were moved to east of I-35. And what I wasn't aware of was that basically was carried out because the city council had been rejiggered to go from a council in which the mayor is involved to a way in which the manager, who is an unelected official, who's appointed by the mayor, essentially is the one who's helping facilitate and making those final decisions. So tracing back the roots of that and being able to really understand, okay, not only is this something entrenched within Austin, and that's certainly not isolated in Austin, but rooted in systemic racism, rooted in the desire to try to stifle people's votes, because this was part of a larger effort to minimize the representation of Black Austinites who were trying to participate. Understanding that, I think, was really key and something, again, I was not aware of. And so, but yeah, it's essentially him kind of going through all the different ways in which I think your average person in Austin, I was certainly, guilty of this. You hear the mayor, you see how forward-facing they are. You assume that they're the ones who are, obviously, along with city council, making all these big decisions. But at the end of the day, that's not the case, right? It is a city manager who is, again, unelected and therefore, in many ways, unaccountable to the people's will in the same way that if they were being voted on.
Yeah, I mean, and just a few years ago, I think it was in the same election cycle where we moved to May. We also moved to a different city council makeup where we had all at-large city council members, and now we have 10 districts with one mayor. At the time, we were the largest city in America that still had that form of government. Now we've changed, and it is more democratic. Neighborhoods have voices, and our council was immediately more diverse. In fact, we elected 7 women on that council, and I think at least 4 or 5 people of color.
Yeah.
And so immediately you saw a difference. And so in this case, I think that what I'm hearing from the opposition is they're concerned about, big, influence, sort of some of that old traditional between 1928 and like 2018, that sort of, traditional power players having more influence over mayor, and getting them elected and things like that. And the other issue I'm hearing is the veto power that the mayor would have over council. So essentially, the way this would work is there would be either 10 or 11 city council members, and the mayor would not set the agenda or vote on them, but he would have a veto power over what the council action was. But that veto could also then be overridden by 2/3 vote of the city council. So if the council's block was large enough on a particular issue, they could override a mayoral veto. It seems to me the veto is probably the biggest sticking point I'm hearing right now, because at least to me, the most legitimate criticism, because the other things that I'm hearing about, corruption and sort of the insider thing happens under the current system, certainly is equally available to happen with a city manager running everything with no accountability than a mayor, who you can at some point choose to not reelect or recall, or some other way to hold accountable more directly than you could a city manager. But the mayor would have the ability to appoint a lot of high profile positions, and that they don't necessarily have right now.
Exactly. And again, like for any people who are listening, I know that's kind of a lot of information, and that's the kind of the big challenge of the proposition, right? Is to make this seem sensible. Essentially, what it boils down to more than anything else is one, if we're talking about a mayor's ability to veto, right? That is a tool that is available at every executive level, really, in government, in our country, right? And we think about, it's something we grow up with, when we talk about the veto with regarding the president all the time. It's obviously not used that often, but it is considered supposed to be a check on certain things within government. So there's that aspect. And then, again, the idea that like worries about corruption. At the end of the day, if you're trying to make the person who's actually making a lot of the decisions be more accountable to the people through elections, I think the idea of corruption, I think it sounds scary, but there are, whether that's through recall, whether that's just through the general election at a certain point, if there's a mayor who's not being representative of the constituents, there's a more direct tool to be able to do that, which again, the city manager, that's an appointed thing. They're very insulated. And I think it'd be good also for us to be able to cite examples, right? Like, whether it was the February winter crisis, whether it was in Austin several years back, there was Austin was put on a boil notice because after a flood, our water cleaning services were overwhelmed. Even just when it comes to natural emergencies, being able to put that power directly within the mayor's hands and therefore more accountable, is not a political thing. It's being able to keep the trains running on time at points when we need it most in the city.
Yeah, and one of the criticisms that is coming from folks is actually from the opposition, and the support isn't necessarily left and right.
Yeah.
And there are progressives on both sides of this issue. What I'm hearing from the opposition in terms of the left opposition and the right opposition, the left opposition is concerned that we might elect a conservative mayor who would then veto all of our progressive legislation. And the right's concern with this is that we elect a progressive mayor,
Yeah.
and they push, whatever the council is doing, and they actually make it happen a lot faster than would otherwise happen. For example, when a lot of the high profile incidents of police violence and things were happening in Austin, and the council did a vote of, I think, essentially no confidence on the police chief.
That's right.
If we had a strong mayor that was progressive, they would have fired the police chief. That didn't happen, and because it's up to the city manager, who didn't have any real pressure on him to do to do that. And so it didn't really happen literally up until this proposition was put up. Nothing there. That's actually the only thing that prompted, in my opinion, because the timing was too coincidental. Otherwise, this proposition became a thing, and then all of a sudden, the police chief is gone. And
Yeah.
so, because it was really the chief example of why, it was the most prominent and current example of a why a strong mayor would be able to do versus a city manager based on what the voters wanted. And so, yeah, so really it comes down to the opposition on the two sides of the opposition is like, well, we don't want a strong conservative versus we don't want a strong progressive. But when I look at Austin's voter turnout, it's been like 60, 70, 65 to actually, I think this time almost 70% for Biden. So I find it hard to believe that we would necessarily get a conservative, Republican mayor that would just be there to sort of troll our city council.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it is important to note also that, like, especially this, I guess this would go more towards the progressives who are concerned about a conservative mayor coming in, as you were just citing, like that the data doesn't really show that that would be the case. But like with all of these issues that we're discussing, none of these things exist in isolation, right? If you have ranked choice, if you have mayoral turnout, mayoral elections during the presidential election, like that is how you ensure that more people's voices are included in the process to begin with. So essentially, like you're just trying to, empower the duly elected official to be able to, perform, more effectively and to carry out on the things that they, propelled them to win in the first place. So the idea of, there being this kind of rogue conservative mayor all of a sudden in Austin, like if we continue to drive turnout, a lot of things would have to happen if that happened. And if that was the case, then that means there's been a huge shift in Austin politics, and the majority of Austinites would want that. And at the end of the day, if we're talking about from an ideals perspective, if we're talking about wanting to increase voter turnout, and we're talking about wanting to combat voter suppression, everything else that we, rightfully criticize from Republicans, we have to be able to continue to push ideals that say, hey, we want as many people to come out as possible, and the people that they elect to be able to perform their jobs well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agree. And so, the other thing that is sort of adjacent to this is again a strong mayor proposition, Proposition F. Proposition G would create a new district, and essentially props H and G, the strong mayor proposition, and this new council district were at one time one proposition. When council put this on the ballot, they separated the two. It's kind of unclear why that was done. But essentially the people that I see who aren't really taking a side on this, including council members, are saying, if you vote for one, vote for both. If you vote against one, vote against both of them. And that's essentially to prevent a tie from happening at the council. Right now, there are 10 council members plus the mayor. That's 11. That's an odd number. If Prop G were to pass and Prop H did not, we would have.
F and G.
Say again?
Sorry, F and G.
Oh, yeah, I said H. Sorry. I don't know my alphabet. If Prop G were to pass with the new district and the strong mayor were not to pass, you would end up with a council of 11 city council members and a mayor, which would obviously make 12 votes. There's certain things that they could do to I don't think that in most cases we'd probably still be with a tie vote. The mayor could also play a different type of role. Like, for instance, in the state legislature, the speaker of the house doesn't actually vote on most things at all. He might vote on ceremonial things. So there are ways around that probably, but essentially that's kind of what the message is from a lot of people is, if you vote for one, vote for both. If you vote against one, vote against both to prevent that from happening. The other pro argument that I've seen, I'd like to hear what else you've heard, but is that it could potentially create another or potentially create an Asian opportunity district, which we don't have in Austin right now. We have we with 10-1, it created an African American opportunity district. and several Hispanic, but not quite enough concentration of the Asian population in one part of the city to create a full district that would give. I think opportunity is something like 30% or something like that, and 11 districts, of the additional district, it might provide that kind of opportunity depending on how it's drawn. So that's one thing that some people are saying could be a positive outcome from an additional seat.
Exactly. No, you're right. And I think at the end of the day, this all comes down to, again, being as inclusive and empowering as many kind of communities that especially may not have a direct through line into the political process as they would otherwise. And yeah, Austin is too big of a city and too, at least outwardly progressive to not kind of seize on that kind of opportunity, especially because, I would, as someone who grew up here, Austin's Asian American community hasn't been always the most prominent in terms of like, certainly not in city politics, but just kind of on the city scene when it comes to being promoted by kind of publications, whatever it may be. And I think some of that is changing,
Mm-hmm.
but this would, not only be in line with, the city's, spoken progressive values, but again, just brings more voices into the fold and brings newer perspectives that are needed.
Yeah, exactly. And so that brings up Prop H, which is the last of these democratic reforms. It's the democracy dollars. This is sort of an old idea, even for Austin, but it's kind of made its way back. And so did not. I don't think it passed the first time, but here it is back again. And this particular. Go ahead.
I said, no, that's right.
Oh yeah, and this particular version is modeled off the Seattle model, which is essentially allows. I think, please correct me if I'm wrong. It's registered voters to have $25 to give to a candidate of their choice, and I think it would only account for municipal elections.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah. So basically, it sends you $25 for every, obviously for the mayoral election, and then if you have a city council district position at stake. So if it were the off chance where you were voting for a mayor and you have a city council at stake, I'm pretty sure from what I understand that you would then get $50 in total. But yeah, these would be vouchers that would be sent directly to people, and they can choose to allocate it to whatever candidate they see fit. That's obviously has to be someone who's already been approved, so they've got gathered enough signatures, etc. But yeah, it'd be a cap number. So it is in a situation where, every single person who gets their voucher can turn it at any different time. I think it'd be a finite amount of money from the city just for budgeting sake, but it makes sense, right? It's getting people more involved in the process, and it can help balance out the fact that I believe when I was talking to Jim Wick earlier, he said something like I think it's under 5% of people who are in Austin at least are donating to local municipal elections. So again, like we're talking about trying to get people more turned out to vote, money is always the kind of dark underlying factor that we can't really talk about. And while this, they can't take the action to take out special interest entirely from other people donating big funds, this is how you at least give people, your average person, the ability to be able to contribute to a campaign. And that also, again, that makes someone feel more invested in that in the first place, because you're choosing where to give those dollars.
Yeah, and this is basically the early stages of sort of public funding of campaigns. We've made some charter revisions in the past few years in Austin to reduce the total amount that any individual can donate. I think it's $350 a person, $700 for a couple, and so this is in a lot of ways at scale. This is competitive with that. There's not a lot of people who, it's certainly not a lot of money, $350, but most people are not giving $350 to a city council candidate. So, that 5% number seems even smaller than I would have guessed, but that's an interesting number. Certainly, as somebody who works for a data firm, I'm very interested in what that data would look like on who would donate, where it goes, what neighborhoods are donating, because that's another big part of it. That 5% probably all live in one or two zip codes, as opposed to 5% just kind of spread around the city. And that's where the influence has been concentrated and the votes in a lot of cases. So I think that is one of the things that this seeks to address, is just to make the process more open to more people. So I'm interested to see. It's honestly not that much money. I think at max it's like $2 million or something like that for the city, and we have no idea if everybody would even use all of it. So, but it would be, yeah. So back up to the top, Proposition A. I think this one seems to be pretty non-controversial. This essentially provides some arbitration for firefighters when they're actually negotiating with the city for their contract. So that I looked around, I didn't see really any opposition. I saw conservatives, Democrats, progressives, everybody seems to be, I mean, when your house is on fire, I mean, nobody's checking your voter status registration. So I think everybody wants them to show up. So that seems to be pretty uncontroversial. I don't know if you have any comments or anything about that one specifically, but
people love firefighters.
Yeah,
what they want.
Right. Yeah. So let's skip over B real quick. That's the most controversial one.
Yeah.
But Proposition C is a police oversight change, which would essentially put the police oversight director, the Office of Police Oversight, back under the city council as opposed to under the police or under the city manager. So in that way, it sort of it basically gives the power of police oversight to council as opposed to the city manager. And in a lot of ways, similarly, this comes out of the sort of the policing issues that we've seen in Austin and around the country. Right.
And this just further builds on action that city council took last year, right? When they took action to reallocate up to, I know it hasn't been that total yet, but up to $150 million from the Austin Police Department's budget towards things like mental health services, towards things like more intervention that is less likely to escalate a variety of different issues. So yeah, this would just, again, a lot of these issues, when you talk through them, it's like every great idea where you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It should be a situation where the oversight of the police probably shouldn't be an in-house type of thing for the department if you want it to do what its express purpose is, which is to provide oversight and to ensure that policies are being followed and that there actually is going to be some level of accountability, which obviously within Austin's police department and Chief Brian Manley stepping down, that hasn't always been the case.
Right. So that brings us to Prop B, which is the most controversial up on the ballot this time around, which is the reinstating of the camping ban for homeless in the city of Austin. Essentially, I think from the way I read it, the prop itself is actually pretty narrow. And I feel like this is much more of a values proposition, so to speak, where people are saying, I'm going to vote my values on this, because it doesn't seem like Prop B actually really addresses the root cause of homelessness or anything like that. It doesn't provide funds for housing or mental health services or any other wraparound services or anything like that for the homeless. It simply just says, we're tired of looking at you. Go somewhere else. And it has been very controversial in the city of Austin since it happened. And I think in part because of the way it happened. I think that it was a mistake the way it was done, in the sense that they were doing some things over here to help with the homelessness issue, buying old hotels, motels to kind of like retrofit for housing for the homeless, and a couple of other things. They're kind of like doing them over here, and then over here they were making a conversation about we should not criminalize homelessness, particularly during a pandemic when people are losing everything, their livelihoods. It's homelessness has increased a lot during this pandemic. But sort of the problem was that I think that they were separated and they weren't married. The solution with ending the camping ban and bringing along with it the solutions as a package deal, I think really hurt from a messaging and PR standpoint. And it kind of gave this crowd, and it's essentially the Republicans, it's led the co-founder of Save Austin Now, is the chair of the Travis County Republican Party. And so it's very clear that they're using this as an opportunity to organize, and really this is like an anti-Austin, anti-city thing. The governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, was today with the one lone conservative council member for city of Austin, and Matt Makoviak, the chair of the Republican Party of Travis County, together at a press conference talking about, vote for Prop B. But I do think it's hard. It's hard. It could be very close. I think even in a progressive city like Austin, because of the PR and the messaging has been done so poorly, that I think that they could actually win. I don't know what your take is on this and kind of what you're seeing out there.
Totally. I mean, yeah, and obviously I know we waited towards. I mean, we saved this one for last for a reason, right? I mean, this is the hot button issue. This is the really thing that I've got my eyes set on in terms of, again, this being voted on in May, when a certain population is more likely to come out that's going to be a little more conservative. Like, this is I think the issue that not only could be the most contentious, or will be the most contentious, but it's the reason I think that probably a lot of people, especially on the right, are going to come out and vote in the first place. And yeah, I think it's just a classic situation where progressives are more likely. I've had trouble at times being able to kind of really articulate what these kind of more heady but substantive policies are doing. And so from a messaging standpoint, that can get lost in the weeds sometimes. Whereas on the right, you have folks who aren't providing any real kind of substantive fix to the issue, but they're being very simple. They're just saying, hey, you don't like seeing those tents up? Let's get rid of them. Let's not try to, pretend that we have the solution to, taking care of these people and being able to combat homelessness in our city, which is growing, but at the end of the day, they're not trying to do that because they're not trying to even pretend to have any kind of compassion there. And it's hard because as you're talking about these kind of two aspects of the homelessness conversation and what this policy was trying to put forward, and it just hasn't really always married to the idea that, like, by not policing homelessness, by not issuing tickets, by not trying to get people to show up to court and then serving warrants and then bringing them to jail, all of that money, which is a lot of money over time, can then be used towards purchasing the hotels that we've seen, that I think they've purchased 4 in the last year and a half about, right? Like that money goes towards addressing the root cause, even if obviously for your average person who's driving down the street and sees, tents, that may not be the most visually appealing thing to them. But the bottom line is, if you clear those tents out, those people are either just they're going to be arrested for camping, or they're going to end up to go where a lot of them were before Austin repealed its camping ban in 2018, which is, in somewhere that's a little less visible in a forest and somewhere so they're still going to be within the city. And as you're talking about too, so much of this, which is missed in these conversations a lot, it comes down to affordability, right? Like, the idea that, homelessness could be an increasing risk in Austin isn't because these policies are just attracting people to Austin now. Hey, it's free camping. No, it's because Austin is growing increasingly unaffordable. And especially during the pandemic, especially whenever we, aren't sure whenever moratoriums on evictions could come up, there's a lot of people who, if they weren't at risk before, certainly at risk now. And it's an issue that's growing, again, from not making the city livable for people who may not be making, working a tech job, whatever it may be, who have the means. People who are working 2 jobs, working minimum wage, right? Like, I saw this number recently where Austin was voted, or not voted, a kind of survey and collection of data. It's talking about Austin is the most difficult city for someone who's making a minimum wage to live in, based on its size, because other places like, in California and even in New York, right, the minimum wage is at least higher. So Austin has this combination of that $7.25 minimum wage and really just skyrocketing cost of living.
Yeah, and largely around property taxes being really high. And to your point about people coming here because it's attractive to camp is pretty silly, but it has been used, and that has been one of the talking points. Interesting to me was I saw one of the leaders of the Prop B campaign is the current police I think he's the president of the police association for Austin, Cassidy. But I saw him post on Facebook a video that he took of a police officer from a neighboring city, one of our suburb cities, and dropping off homeless people in downtown Austin from their city. And so it's not even that homeless people are coming from other places; they're being brought here by people who don't want to see them in their city, and they say, "Oh, we'll just bring them to Austin," which of course exacerbates the issue that we're seeing with the rise in the homelessness population, because they don't want to deal with them and they don't want to pay a fee, and the state isn't doing anything to help. And so it's really, yeah, it's a housing issue. And to your other point about the money that we could be saving, in Texas, it costs about $50,000 a year to house somebody in jail in the criminal justice system. And, that doesn't count, the judicial part of it. That's just literally warehousing them and feeding them every day and giving them health care. And the idea that we want to house them in jail versus, just building housing and giving them the proper services so that they can then turn around and be productive citizens is kind of lazy, and it's unfortunate, and it's not very ethical in my opinion to criminalize mental health, which is a lot of the times a part of the issue, at least part of the issue. And then there's big movement for criminal justice reform, and we have to view this as part of that.
Yeah.
Whether it's today is 420, right? So there's been a lot of politicians talking about we need to not only like remove the current marijuana laws, but like we need to expunge records, and we need to like let people out of jail who are in there for possession only. This is going to help communities. This is going to reduce the costs that we're spending on for-profit prisons. Let's find better, more creative ways to house people. And the community first village that was built in the Austin area is like about to double in size. And there are great examples of things that are happening even within Austin to address this. But it's kind of like how we started the top of this podcast. This is a bigger political issue. This is not just about, they aren't even trying to solve the homelessness issue. They're using phrases like save the homeless, vote for Prop B, which is ludicrous on the surface, but it might confuse people who actually want to help the homeless people, and they might vote for Prop B because they think Prop B is somehow going to help homeless people. But we're seeing at the state legislature, they're passing bills that would address this state on a statewide basis. And that brings us right back to where we started, which is that what happens in Austin, as UT says, what happens here changes the world. Well, we know that what happens in Austin, we're likely to see at the statewide level being pushed by the legislature. So that's why I think Austin is so important to take a look at these issues, whether it's policing or homelessness, because what happens here is bound to be seen across the state of Texas. And so, all we can do, I guess, is encourage people to get informed and to go out, exercise their right to vote, but make an informed decision, and use whatever research you can. And so, I don't know if you have any other parting words, but
yeah, no, I think I think at least on this kind of final point, it's it's obviously very complex, because homelessness hits at a lot of our society shortcomings when it comes to affordability, when it comes to mental health services, when it comes to a variety of different things, right? No one just ends up on the street. It comes from a myriad of different things intersecting in their lives. But no, whether you're in Austin, whether you're listening to this in Houston, Dallas, wherever you are, El Paso, right? Like, I just think something to remember when it comes to homelessness is that when someone gets a ticket for violating a campaign ban or whatever it may be, for being for being homeless, that sticks on their record, especially if they don't show up to court, which the majority of folks in those positions do not. And what that does then is when they do, say they're up for affordable housing and they've been waiting, when their turn comes up, or if they are able to get in a position where somehow they're able to make enough money to then be able to apply for an apartment somewhere, that black mark is going to be on their record, and it makes them less likely to be able to get that apartment that they need, which when you have a secure home and you have a secure space, that is the launching pad for everything. Yeah. So this isn't just a kind of, a minor inconvenience for someone. This is, broad reaching effects for years to come. But yeah, as you talked about, I know we focused a lot on Austin in this issue or in this conversation, but at the end of the day, these have ramifications across the state. A lot of these progressive policies that are being pushed in Austin, we would hope and expect to see those things come through in some of the other cities around the state. But it's also already drawing a response from the state legislature and from Governor Abbott. So, these are conversations that we need to have and need to continue having.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's how the Republicans have for a long time sort of organized and from the bottom up. And it started in the 70s when they went to with school board. They started recruiting at the school board level. And now they're kind of full circle back through these city propositions and building support against progressive reforms that way and taking it all the way back to the ledge. So anyway, thanks so much, David. I appreciate you joining us and talking through some of these, and appreciate your perspective and everything that you learned from Jim and all your other research that you've done over the last year. And to everyone else, thanks for joining us, and to our patrons, we really appreciate your support for continuing to make sure that we can do the kind of progressive journalism that you get from TexasSignal.com and all of our other channels and podcasts. And so again, the early voting ends April 27th and election day is Saturday, May 1st. So make sure to go out and get your voice heard. And until then, until next time, we'll see y'all later.